If you are here today for supporting youth with foster experience in the crisis care continuum, focusing on action planning, you're in the right place.
We are going to be talking about action planning. We're working with youth in crisis that are a part of the foster care system, incorporating and embedding lived experience and peers into your system to support with family engagement, as well as system navigation, and of course, wellness and recovery and resiliency principles. And then our last session was on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so if you were at the first one, we introduced the Plan, Do, Study, Act. And then even in our diversity, equity, and inclusion, we introduced a couple of tools and how to consider creating SMART-T goals, which is the I and the E on the SMART goals is ensuring that you're doing that out of an inclusive and equitable lens. And so today we'll talk about what does that look like in regards to action planning. How do you build that culture, and what does culture change look like when you're looking at bringing in something new? So whether that's incorporating peers, incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion, addressing or putting in additional strategies to address foster youth in crisis, that all of those pieces require us to consider what our current culture looks like and its preparation for change in the future, or even now. And we recognize and have gone through numerous cultural changes, if not from shifting or changing our from residential to more community-based services, to a merger, to a name change over the years. And both myself and Christina as presenters have been with the organization, I would say a combined 30 years. I've been there, I've been with Stanford Sierra Youth and Families for 17 years, and Christina can share how long she's been there as well. But in my role as Chief Family and Youth Partnership Officer, I provide support to an amazing team of those with lived experience, including myself, that are either co-located in child welfare county systems, or providing community-based support through the mental health, juvenile justice, or child welfare systems locally in Sacramento County. And then we have an empowerment training center. We have support through kinship navigation, housing navigation. So lots of different programs and community supports that are offered through our pretty amazing team. And so I'll pass it to Christina.
I've been with the organization for 15 years, and actually I began my career working in our foster care program. And that's probably where I spent the majority of our time, and have my lived experience from childhood to adulthood connected to child welfare. Not myself, but my family took in and adopted my youngest brother, who has some significant mental health challenges. And we can talk about some systemic and system responses and where he's at now, but I'm not going to stand on that soapbox today. Just as he's a Black man who has significant mental health issues, and then the wrong diagnosis, right, because of what he looks like. And then we, as you know, I have my own family, but then we had a young man join our family from the foster care system. So lots of touches and impacts with foster care, same for Ebony. So I think that when we talk about foster youth, there is a special place in our heart that we really advocate for kids who are impacted by child welfare, but also how do we make sure the continuum for them is built well and advocated for, and that we're looking at all parts that play for these kids in their life. So.
Perfect. And so here is our agenda for today. So, before we talk about action planning and considering what we're going to plan for, this is a really great time to discuss action planning. Is if your fiscal year runs from July 1 to June 30th, as ours does, and a lot of organizations do, you might already be considering what changes you might need to make to your organizational practices to ensure that youth and family voices are elevated, integrated, decided that those that are experiencing crisis, considering nationally, we're looking at ways to address crisis in a more comprehensive, multidisciplinary approach, that we're not strictly leaning on law enforcement when someone is experiencing a mental health crisis. You'll see that some of the national suicide lines now, instead of reaching them, you will now call 988. So there's a lot of different changes coming through here that we really need to be aware of, and has local impacts to us in California and in other states around how we now consider addressing family crisis and supports, and what that change needs to look like within our organizations, what small shifts we might need to make or big shifts we might need to make, and the impacts to that on our culture, our agency culture. And so we'll talk about what are the key elements of an outcome-driven culture. As you've probably experienced over the last 5 years or so, we've seen an increase in our contracts, as well as other organizations have seen the same, in not just saying, here's a contract, please work with those, with youth and families, but here's a contract, and here are the anticipated deliverables. Here's also how we expect to your outcomes to look. And so that's that outcome-driven culture, where we're saying you will provide support to youth and families, and the 80% of those families will meet their wellness outcomes, or you will reduce crisis within those families and support systems, by a certain percent. And so we want to be mindful of those. We want to build a culture where we do have outcomes, because at the end of the day, the positive impact on those that we support, the positive impact on youth and families, is what we want ultimately to achieve, is to have those. And we can't do that without measuring the outcomes. And so we'll talk about some of the elements, the key elements we had to embed when we shifted to an outcome-driven culture. We'll share examples of that. And then you'll have an opportunity to reflect on existing processes within your organization and what an action plan can look like. And we call our action plans outcomes, activities, and measurements, which in short, and if you wanted another alphabet soup, it is OAMs. And so that's, we'll share that as a handout for you to be able to take a look at and consider utilizing within your own organization. A little bit about our journey. I mentioned when I was first introducing myself that we've had some changes even within our own organization, where we've had to consider culture and the needs there. And so this is kind of just a quick snapshot of some of those changes that have been made over the last 15 to 20 years since I've been with the organization, where our viewpoints have changed, that as we have evolved as a community and nationally around how we better serve youth and families, that we've had to change our own culture. We could not do business as usual. We couldn't consider the same things as normal, and that we had to accept, and not just accept, but really embrace change as a constant and consistent part of our lives, and that there is going to be new ways and that we need to continue to look at things, and that is a part of the action planning and change process. Is that there will be new strategies. When I started, trauma-informed care was not something that was talked about. Like, it just wasn't, like, we came in, we provided support to youth and families from our own lens. We did not consider families the experts. We very rarely, if at all, consulted with parents and caregivers. We just kind of laid out a plan, and then, expected that they would follow that plan. And when they didn't, we oftentimes labeled them as resistant, or, aggressive at times if they didn't follow at all, non-compliant. I mean, I could think of all kinds of other language that was used to describe families. And I can share, at that time, I had not had I was not embedded in my own lived experience just yet. And so I was even operating from that viewpoint until I had the change of then having to navigate those same services and realizing just how many gaps and opportunities for growth there was. And so a part of our journey was really seeing residential as a placement option instead of kind of leaning towards where we're at now, which is that it's a short-term treatment option and a resource, a short-term resource, not anything long-term. We came to that as a part of our journey prior to even the shortened lengths of stay that are now a requirement and as a part of our reform. But that's something that was for sure a culture change for us. We also were very child and youth centered. So very much so we are there to save the child instead of really looking at the entire family, and that our young people were not operating in silos. We could not support them with their well-being without addressing the entire family and all of the dynamics, and providing enough support to the mom, the dad, the mom's dads, siblings, the whole family as a unit that everyone deserved and should experience support within that entire family unit. We looked at, instead of behavior modification, what kind of trauma-informed evidence-based practices, as well as community practices, could we explore with youth and families, and then a reliance on staff resources as an intervention to really maximizing community resources and supports, and maximizing family involvement and engagement, the natural support system versus the staff being the end-all intervention for youth and families. And so we needed to do a reflection of our own mission and vision. This is currently our current mission. And it's evolved, again, has changed as we've changed, and it's reflected here in that. And it's transforming lives by nurturing permanent connections and empowering families to solve challenges together so that every child can thrive. And so prior to this mission, we had other missions that didn't have the words like family, empowerment, permanent. And so those words were really important to us, because it really was able to articulate our goal of really making sure families were empowered, that they had the tools that they needed to provide and ensure that youth had permanent connections as well. And so this was also a part of our culture change, is that frontline practice really focused on permanency and improved well-being. And so when we started there, regardless of whether a family really was experiencing crisis, whether we needed to improve practices in any of our areas, we knew that our why was that our families had improved permanency and connections and improved well-being. And then we could work backwards from there. And so we knew that required change in our practices, and a culture shift from staff, that we needed to engage and champion from our board, as well as increase stakeholder involvement, but also stakeholder and funder education, because if we were already viewing families from a lens that was not family-centered, was not equitable or inclusive, then that messaging was definitely permeating in our community and to our funders. If you're in California and you're familiar with Sleep Train, and I don't even know if they've changed their name, but
they're no longer in existence. I think they were. There was a merger that happened with them.
Okay, so does anyone remember the commercials, and feel free to just put it in the chat because I can't see your faces, but where it was talking about foster youth, and the foster youth they would say, "I just wish I had shoes," and then the next foster youth would say, "I only wanted some blankets to sleep on," right? And so then they were like, Sleep Train supports foster youth with these things, and it's like the messaging was what?
Negative. It was so negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really negative. It made it seem like foster youth didn't have shoes, that they weren't cared for, that they weren't with resource and foster families that were providing that, were required to provide that, and that by state law, kids were not, coming into care and in foster care without those necessities. But the image to the community who's not working directly in child welfare services, could be that that's the case. And so that funder education, community education is all really important when you're thinking about change, especially if we're talking about crisis, diversity, equity, inclusion, and what does peer supports really mean. We have to be able to educate our internal teams as well as externally share what kind of messages we're hoping the community can understand better. It's also important when we're recruiting, hiring, and training as well, that there's an ongoing practice of ensuring that these values, our culture is also integrated into how our new employees or long-term employees are learning and engaging with new information as well. And when we have those pieces, these requirements for practice change, so involvement with staff at all levels for the culture shift, engagement with board, community education, funder education, and then staff education, we see the results of better outcomes for youth and families, improved morale. We find that when our team and our colleagues are highly involved in any type of change and planning process, that they're more engaged. It doesn't feel like something's happening to them, but more so with them. There's an organization that I was tasked to consult with in another state, and the executive leadership developed all of the outcomes for the directors of these residential programs without them. And so when I pulled up my PowerPoint and all of the deliverables, it was just like crickets and quiet, because they were expected to work a plan that they had no involvement in creating. And so they were disengaged, they were resentful, and so and their morale was low. They joined the meetings late, they had reasons to leave early. When we would check in on their progress, there was very little to none made. And we finally had to go back and talk with leadership and all of leadership combined, and address the fact that those things had happened and planning had happened without employee engagement, and just how important that is in a part of this process. And so we saw that. And then we also saw greater fiscal strength, because the more funders were also engaged and there was more community education, the more they were engaged in multiple parts of a process change, the more they were actually willing to provide additional funding, because they really felt truly engaged and knowledgeable about what was happening within the organization. They could speak to it with ease, and in turn wanted to provide more funding because they were really truly engaged and felt that they had a voice in the process. And all of those things were really important. Resistance will happen whenever we're talking about changing anything. Change is really scary, and I'll put all of these here on the slide here for you. But this little baby's face says it all, right? That whenever there is change, it can feel, even when it's a good change, it can still feel very uncomfortable. And so we have to acknowledge that while some of us may run into change, I am one of those people, so I am super mindful around, just because I might be excited about it, that others might not. And so tempering my enthusiasm with others and my colleagues, as I know that I'm like, oh, this is a better practice, let's do it now, because I know it's in the best interest of youth and families. So my enthusiasm is really high. But it can be really scary, and the what's in it for me, what does this mean for me, how will this impact me, how will this impact those I work with, are all questions that folks might have. And so we really need to be mindful of that and know that resistance will happen. Some of the things that can be considered when we're thinking about that resistance, and some of the areas that can really make a positive impact, is communicating the vision and mapping out the plan. So very first is making sure they're a part of when the change is going to happen and getting feedback on it, because then that means they're involved. And then as the new plan is developed, that the vision is communicated, the impact to those that we're serving is communicated, and the plan is mapped out that's very clear and articulates what the next steps are. if there's an opportunity to identify early adapters and the resistors, to do that. We are changing our some of our HR practices and annual review. I'm one of the ones that right now who's not exactly excited about it. Our old practice actually stinks. So I can just be honest that the old practice actually stinks. So I should be excited about a new practice. But the system we've been in is just not that great and hasn't helped really a lot. And so now we're moving into that same system. So like the excitement is just very minimal. I would probably be considered a resistor, even though I won't like vocalize that to anyone else. However, what they did was as they're piloting this new thing, they already had early adapters who were practicing and testing out the system. And one of them is someone on my team that Christina was sharing with me last week. So I was like, oh, I got to talk to James because James was an early adapter and James will give me the real, right? And so that's helpful for me as I'm a resistor. I want to know, like, from someone I trust, what was it like? Give me the real. Did it stink? Was it a bad way? Like, did you have a hard time? So that he can maybe make me a champion, right? Eventually I will turn into a champion. I'm a leader. I have to champion this thing. So how can I get there? And a part of that is those early adapters and champions that really, can be a voice and share if something might, will work and how it's worked for them. And so both are really critical in the change process. Because I'm a resistor, I'm going to critically look at it from a critical view, which means that I'm going to be able to provide some constructive feedback. So resistors are actually a good thing, because as you are rolling out a new plan of action, it will need to be refined. And so in our first series, the Plan, Do, Study, Act is all about planning, doing, studying, which means we go back and see, does this work? And then we act on what we need to potentially change. That's a part of the change. So we know, first plan, rollout of a plan of action. Let's just be clear, like the likelihood of it rolling out on its first try and it being magical and everything working as it should is highly unlikely. And that's okay. That's because we're human. That's because we know that we may need to make those changes, and that not everything works as it should the first time around. And then it says find the champions or convert them into champions. Okay, or convert them into champions. I was going to say, is that wrong? But yes. So find the champions, and then figure out how we can convert the resistors into champions. But that takes that feedback and open space for them to be able to share what they're concerned about to bring them over to the champion side. Christina, did you have?
Anytime we're talking about change, and we're talking about adapters or resistors, I think that sometimes the understanding or the definition around resistors, but redefining also what that means, right? If you're feeling hesitant or have some trepidations about moving forward, how do we have folks be mindful and actively listen to what that is, so that we can have everyone on the same page and address the areas that maybe an adapter isn't seeing? But champions are important, as they can help solidify language and can be folks to really advocate and make sure that everyone is on board. I think that they're critical when we're talking about communication and change.
What is the purpose? What is your cause? What do you believe? And so even for us kind of changing, how we're doing our consultation and the system we're using, the why is so that we can provide more seamless, supports to our colleagues, to our team members, to the staff that we might be supervising and then supporting. And so having a more seamless and consistent process means that our staff culture around receiving feedback, receiving kudos, reviewing their annual employee plan is one that feels welcoming and supportive to them. And we want that. So that's our why, right? Our cause is so that they experience the workspace as a safe space to make mistakes, to grow, and that it's a supportive environment. The how is that we have a system that allows for that communication to take place and to document what's happening and the change that's happening, and to document when things are going well and areas of growth. And then the result is, how does that feel for others? Does it feel that way? Did we accomplish what we hoped and what we set out to achieve? And so we want to be able to, when we're thinking about planning for action, first identify why. What is the why behind the plan that we're developing? What's the how? How will we get there? And then how will we measure the results? What's the proof? And that's kind of our outcome. Activities is the how, and then the measurements is the results. So that's kind of our why, how, and what in the OAMs that we'll share with you. Communication allows for the opportunity to discover the family's values. Absolutely. So this is action planning. How do we ignite that change process? And I shared some of this already, so I'll quickly kind of go through this. But just, leaders have to be a part of driving the change. That the shift of culture really, right? If you've been in an organization where you're like, leadership is all saying this over here, but we're all doing this over here, or leadership is saying this is what should happen, but I'm on the ground floor and I see that is not reflective of what is really happening. So leaders drive the change and the why, but it has to flow into every facet or every department, program of the organization. And that means that everyone must be on board. So while they might start off driving the change, all of us are responsible for really being a part of driving that change to success. And that means that we're all constantly being a part of, communicating the why. So we're talking through the why. Whenever there's change happening, I think that's one area that we often forget, is to say, this is why it's happening. This is the impact. This is what we're hoping to achieve. We often just move into, the next steps. This is the plan, but really not going back to the why behind it. So I can't say enough just how important that commitment to expressing the why and how that's communicated is critical to engagement of your colleagues and teams, as well as families, right? If we're, and Jennifer mentioned that in the chat, even when we're talking about creating plans and action planning, not just organizationally, but with those that we're supporting in the community as a direct service support provider, if you're if you have lived experience, or you're a clinician or a social worker or a probation officer, or you're working in the schools, if you're developing that plan with your students, youth, families, right, the why behind it, helping them find their why, also creates the change that they're hoping to see, because you can always go back to that. That's their compass. That's our compass of how we're going to make that change within a community and within our families. And so the why must really resonate with everyone involved for that change to happen. Even when we mess up, or we don't get to where we need to, where we're hoping to achieve, we can always go back and say, does the why still work for us? Do we need to shift that? Is it changed, and then be able to reflect from there. And then, of course, that regular evaluation of what's working, what's not, through the data review, right? Even with youth and families, when we're looking at their case plan or their therapeutic plan or their IEP plan, there's their individualized education plan, right? If we're looking and seeing that benchmarks are not being met or that goals are not being achieved, we go back and we evaluate, and we do that regularly so that we know what changes we need to make. That plan, do, study, act. And then we take action when we need to, if there's something that needs to change.
I think, and connecting it back to the why. So as I said, why is the unifier. And so if you look at our roof, that's really the why, right? Like that's why we're doing what we're doing. And also the foundation, which is our values of compassion, equity, excellence, honor, integrity, partnership. These two things are pivotal as we're talking about the work that happens in between, the people, the services, the infrastructure, the impact we hope to have, and innovation that we want to move through the work, and how we want to move through the work and make sure that happens. But another critical part is we're going to go into it in detail. So I'm only going to touch on it briefly because we have a slide for it. Our process metrics and our recognition and celebration. And where that is it's not just for our staff, but it's also for our families, and to be family centered. We need to champion them and cheer them on when they're doing something amazing. They may not be able to see it. And so we do that. And it's the same for our staff. It's that continuum of the why and celebrations in it as we're serving families, but also how we're serving our staff. It couldn't work having our vision, having our mission, having our values, and all of these pillars couldn't work if the folks who were doing the work are not also feeling connected to the why and having very clear understanding of how to be, how to be connected. So that's the training, being evaluated next to the why and the training and the ultimate goal of the mission, vision, values, talking about it in consultation that's that accountability measure, right? Of being connected to the why. And then having our admin, our administration, having the culture really be living and breathing the why, the values, the vision. I'm sure that most of you have been connected, or I've seen organizations be connected to a vision that's very vague, but then you meet the people and it's a misalignment. And you're like, I'm not seeing how the mission and vision of this organization isn't necessarily aligned. Or, there's all kinds of programs that want to sell you, right, on these very big missions. And then unfortunately, you don't have great connection and services and what that looks like. And so it's why it's hypercritical to make sure that you're walking this out in all the ways and talking about those results at the end of it to make sure that they are still connected to the mission, vision, and values of your program, of the goal, of the why. 3 core pathways we have for our, as you kind of saw in our house, but this is it broken down. So our mission, vision, and values, that really is the driver. That's the why. That's what we're all connected to in the organization. Our process metrics, and back to that alphabet soup, outcomes, activities, measurements, short word OAM, that holds us accountable to what and how we're doing it. And then our recognition and celebration really is about how do we continue to champion and celebrate those victories so that people can continue to be bought into the why, right? And to know that the what and the how are working. This is the accountability plan, right? This is the 3 core pathways. If we're going to say it, this is how we're doing it. And this is how we get there.
So think of if you have your own organization around those 3 core pathways, the why, consider the why being your mission, your vision, your values. So even on this previous slide, if you see down below that our values are compassion, equity, excellence, honor, integrity, and partnership. Those are at the bottom. Those are, and then our mission and our vision are at the top. So it's like that values is really our strong foundation. And then the vision and mission is like our roof, right? It's kind of top and bottom of reflection of why we do what we do. And so when we're, particularly up against a challenge, we're going back to our mission, our vision, and we're also looking at our values. Are we doing this from a lens of equity? Are we operating with integrity? Are we looking at the partnerships that need to be in place? Are we partnering with families in the right way? Are we honoring families and also expressing compassion for what they're experiencing, and not just compassion for our youth and families, but compassion for our staff as well? And so those are all really important parts of the why that helps us to compass back to where we need to go. And as Christina shared, that OAMs is our how, and then the recognition and celebration is how we celebrate when we're, the good work that's happening out in the communities and within our organization. And so those process metrics are really important. That's how we measure success. It defines the activities that we're going to do to achieve the outcomes that we hope to accomplish. So this is a part of our action planning. And then the measurements are clearly defined. And that's how we evaluate whether or not we've achieved the outcome that we hope to have happened. And so we have an ongoing process, very similar to the Plan, Do, Study Act, is we put the plan in place, but then we're reviewing it for feedback. We're sharing it within our teams. So as we're developing a goal or an outcome, it's developed with the team. We are, bringing visibility to it. So we're sharing it not just within our team, but sharing it with other teams and seeing if there's opportunity for partnerships. So even our outcomes, activities, and measurements all have our values embedded as a part of it as well. We're looking to make sure it's equitable. We're looking to make sure it's done with integrity. But we're also providing an opportunity for learning, because there's times where we don't meet our outcomes. And there's times where all of us, all departments and programs might have that similar outcome and none of us met it. And it's a good chance to go back and go like, why are none of us like continuing to not meet this area? What needs to be refined or changed? Because maybe we've put something in place that's not attainable. We had one this year where we hadn't met it for a couple of years, and it was related to documentation. It was related to all of our team getting documentation in within 48 hours of seeing a youth and family. And we were not able to meet it. We put in collaborative documentation in place, which was really in alignment with our values, because it is really important for us to be transparent in our communication with families and what we're documenting about them, that we don't just go back to our desk and type up what we listened and heard and put a plan together, and then we're not sharing that with them. But as we're typing it, we're sharing our screen with them. We're really being transparent in our time with them. And we saw our ability to be able to meet our 48-hour goal because of the fact that we put the collaborative documentation in. But it took a long time for us to go back and try to figure out, why are we not meeting this to get there? And so those are those feedback, review, opportunity for learning, opportunity for accountability, and honest analysis and an honest analysis for improvement. We're also exploring what else needs to be in place to ensure that we are operating from an action planning, outcome-driven space. And that means that we're honoring these family-centered practices. And if you're familiar with wraparound or have been a part of wraparound, you'll be familiar with these, as they're a part of the guiding principles. Our organization decided in 2005 that we were adopting these as our whole agency practices. So we were not just saying, oh, this belongs to just this one program. We recognize that every program in the organization should be operating from these. And if they were, we saw greater outcomes. So if we were working with youth and families and there was a challenge, they were in crisis, we always went back to this during our consultation. Are we looking at their needs? Are we identifying their strengths? How are we elevating their voice and choice? How are we leaning on communities? How are we individualizing and not having a cookie cutter approach? How are we being more culturally responsive? And how are we being more persistent? So parts of our outcomes driven culture is, hiring and training is we have to be able to make sure we're all on the same page, and there's a culture around how we view action planning, that there are outcomes, activities, and measurements for pretty much everything we're doing. We have to be able to measure it to know that it's making an impact and a change. So we say OAMs for everything. That we also don't just say, great job, you did it, but that those outcomes and those action plans are actually merit-based. So if those plans are achieved and we meet those goals, that there is a compensation directly correlated to that. So everyone at the organization is not just getting the same raise. Like, some agencies and organizations are just like, everyone gets 1% or 2% or 3% flat rate across the board. Your merit is based on your pay or increase is based on your outcomes for the year as well. And so that merit-based pay is directly correlated to your job description and the deliverables within that. So it's very clear, and it's a very collaborative process. Another part of that is how important it is to have accessibility to the data, because when we're making those measurements, they have to really be objective and not subjective. So making sure we have accessibility to the correct data, and then also making sure that we take as many touch points as we can as possible to recognize and celebrate progress, accomplishments, and achievements from everyone.
And that's like from big scale, right, to little scale. So like as an organization, how are we honoring and recognizing those who work really hard? And if we drill down to that, how is the manager recognizing that person? And so even in partnership with our human resource department, there is what we call an area of recognition that would go in this employee's file, that would really celebrate them. This person is recognized in team meetings. So when we're talking about recognition and celebration, we want to make sure that we're doing it through and through, from big picture right down to team interactions. So going back to that hiring and training, so key components to think here, multi-step, we have a multi-step interview process. So we don't just do one interview and we're done. We actually do multiple interviews, and we're always assessing first, is this person a good fit for the organization? Is this person naturally aligned with our mission, vision, and values? Is this person naturally aligned with family-centered practices? What's the language that they're using as they're answering questions? Because those things have an impact, right? Like how people view the world, how they view the work, all of that has an impact on, is this going to be turbulent because this is who we are as an agency, and this is not necessarily personal values that align with someone we're looking to hire? And is the stretching and growing of this person going to be one that's going to be easy, or one that's going to be of constant feedback? And what we know is that if you give someone constant feedback, their morale may be low, they may not be bought in and being a champion. So we're looking for all of this in the beginning, obviously including HR and all the processes, making sure that we're looking at both behavior and values, multi-level certified hiring panel. So family partners and youth advocates are involved in every interview, because we're looking for family-centered language. Is this person going to potentially be added to a treatment team that is going to trigger a family on a continuous basis? Where are those struggles? We're listening and feeling for all of that.
Yeah, and that was really a part of, when we think about culture change and putting a plan of action in. We said we wanted to be a more family-centered organization. We knew that having lived experience staff as a part of the interviewing process for our social workers, clinicians, juvenile justice practitioners, anyone, even our front desk staff, our finance staff, right? We're, our team is at all of those interviews to ensure that we're creating and hiring for a stronger culture that is more family, has a better family-centered approach. And so that became really important to us. When we think about the plan, do, study, act, and even action planning in this step as well, is we have the multi-step interview process as Christina shared, and we started realizing we're losing people. Like, we can't have a bunch of steps and then other people are applying. We know the Great Resignation is real. So even just over this last year, we have moved some of the multi-step interview process to, they'll interview for 45 minutes. And if the interview goes well, then the next 45 minutes will be the role play. Instead of having to wait another week and reschedule for the second interview, we're moving them directly into that second interview process right away. And so piloting that has also been something where that's that plan, do, study, act. It's not continuing to work. We're calling them back for their second and they're like, nah, we straight, we got a job somewhere else. Or, they've just disengaged from the process. Those are important pieces to think of and consider as well. So that's a part of our action planning is also considering what needs to be changed in that process to also create a better experience, not just for us and making sure we're hiring the right folks, but also a better experience for those that are applying for jobs. And so that they're not lost in the process or wondering what the next steps are, or feel like it's taking too long and they want a job now, but they're waiting, 2 to 3 weeks for our process. Plus then they get the offer and they have to do background checks and wait for that. So it's really important for us to really kind of continuously review whatever plans we have in place for this.
And it's trauma informed, right? Like, because what we've also recognized is you have the first interview, you're waiting for the second one, you've been told it's a role play. I'm having anxiety about what that looks like now. And so we really analyzed, right, reevaluated how we're doing it so that we are being also trauma informed. So here we have effective hiring. What we know is that like the right people stay longer. They're connected to the values. And what we know is that when someone's really connected to the heart of the matter, that they're more willing to not only stay longer, but the money doesn't necessarily have as an impactful rule in whether they do the work or not, right? Because they're connected to the values, they're connected to the outcomes, they're connected to the why. Our managers and leaders spend more time in employee development. So we're really making sure we're spending a lot of quality time with someone who is being newly hired in that process so that they understand fully that we're connected to the culture from the beginning to the end, but that they're seeing it in action by the time we're spending together. And then we can talk about challenges, we can address some things, speak to present time, future time, and then we have greater employee engagement in the mission. Like that's the goal. The goal is that the mission, the why, continues to stay the focus.
So we talked already about these OAMs at every level. And so you'll see kind of just how we kind of take a look at our own planning and even our strategic planning, which our strategic planning happens every 3 years. And so, but there's priorities that come out of that, which then contribute to our annual operating plan. We put our outcomes, activities, measurements in place. That trickles down into program and departments, and then that trickles down into our employee development planning. So each employee has their own individualized development plan that focuses on the deliverables for that program and department, but also includes a professional development goal. And that could be anything that they choose to develop in personally. And some examples of that have been just around like caring for themselves better, starting a walking group at the organization, holding space to write and journal more. So again, when we're thinking about changing culture, we're also and putting action plans together, we're looking at our employees and ourselves as whole people, not just that are meeting deliverables of the organization, but also what does it look like outside of work, and how can we also see them as a whole person, not just the employee within the organization. And that's been something that's been really important, and also think helps with retention within family and youth partnership, is that we care far more. We care much so about the outcomes and deliverables of our department, but we also care like how you're doing on the weekends and the evenings, and do you have the right balance, and what needs to be put in place there, and how are we considering that in professional development, because being able to develop professionally also means that you're considering all those other aspects, and that also contributes to your success as an employee.
And it contributes to like, people want to be seen, people want to be included. And so the professional development goal is really an opportunity to see people beyond who they are at the organization, as Ebony said. But like, I had someone who was like, I want to start a therapy dog program for foster youth. And I know we can't do that here, but that's what I want to do. So we talked about, well, what are some of those action steps that are aligned with also the work we do here, and how can we help you dig more into that? So when you do want to step out and start your own business, you have some of this research, you have some of these skills, so that you feel like it's an easy transition. And we weren't scared of it. So like, that's the other part, right? I don't want to develop that because I don't want to lose this person, but actually it kept them more engaged.
That's a huge point, Christina, just around if an employee is like, my goal is to leave here. And we're like, oh no, we don't want to lose you. But we also want you to grow. And if growing means growing out of the organization, we embrace it and support it and help them put a plan together. And we just see higher rates of engagement, but we also see opportunities to see is what they're looking for within the organization, maybe just in a different department. And those are important parts of that planning as well. SMARTY goals, not just how are you in doing your job, but how are you as a person, and deeply caring about that person outside of that work. And making sure that there is balance. And so that's I think huge. So here is when you're thinking about planning and putting together a goal in place. Our OAMs all are out of the SMARTY lens. So we definitely want it to be specific, clearly defined, that it's measurable, that there is tangible evidence that we've accomplished that goal. That is achievable. So there's a stretch, but it's also something that can actually be accomplished, right? That we want to stretch ourselves, but not to the point to where it feels unattainable or unachievable. That it's able to be measured. That's the result focus. That there's a completion date. So it's not just ongoing, but we have some, objective completion dates. It's inclusive. So again, that planning process includes those that it impacts, that we're not just like, thank you for coming, here's your goal, right? But then here's what we were thinking. What do you think? How should we refine this? There are some things that we would call like non-negotiables. And that goes to, this was in our contract and we agreed, and those are some of those things that we can't change. However, while we say that we can't change it right now, if there's feedback on it, if it's not equitable, if it's not achievable, then those are things that we want that feedback, because when we're meeting with, say, our contract monitors monthly, and those are areas that need to be changed, we're going to give that feedback, or we're going to support staff in giving that feedback related to that. And we actually have our advocacy team, and I know Jennifer Churchill is familiar with this, that if we're meeting with, our teams are filling out reports related to how our youth and families experiencing our services, and what feedback do we have to system change. And so that goes back to, you can put a plan into place, but the families and the youth are the ones ultimately who are experiencing it. And so then if there's feedback on that, how do we plan, do, study, act, and shift the plan to better serve the youth and families? And so that's an inclusive and equitable lens, right? We're viewing it out of that. We're seeing what needs to be shifted and adjusted based on who we're serving, those demographics. Do they look differently for communities of color? And if so, whether that's negative or positive, how do we shift or adjust to make sure that it's equitable for everyone? That regardless of how they identify, whether that's race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, that their outcomes are equitable, and our services are adjusted and equitable to meet their needs. So this is an example of one of our OAMs, or outcomes, activities, and measures. And so this is our leadership outcome was that we would increase professional development opportunities. We discussed and decided on 3 activities. And when we developed this, we developed it with our colleagues, with our team members who were going to be impacted by it. So we wanted, our team was asking for more training opportunities. They wanted more ongoing development and training opportunities. They wanted to have an increase in the support to their wellness. We also recognized that with the pandemic, there was more of a need to focus on wellness within the workspace, because things had gone virtual. Meetings where you would now drive from one appointment to the next were now stacked back to back. And also because of the virtual environment, our team building, where we would do in person, now also had to be virtual and didn't feel the same. And so we wanted to really create space where we were addressing these things within our department, our program, to create a more supportive space for our team members. And so the first measurement you'll see is, if we're looking at it from, is it equitable? Is it inclusive? Is it specific? And the deadline, is it achievable? The first measurement is that we would gather feedback from staff. Remember, with our fiscal year starting July 1, so we had a month to get feedback from staff on what trainings they wanted to see offered, right? So that's now we're making sure we're involving the feedback there. That we would have these bi-monthly lunch and learns for through June 30th, 2022. That we would also have our peer wellness groups one time monthly. So you're seeing some deadlines, but also frequency in the measurements. that there would be individual wellness plans completed by 10/1/2021. So all employees would kind of think about what they wanted to focus on in regards to wellness, and they'd have the opportunity to check in about it with their supervisors. That there would also be position-specific support offered. So if you were a family partner, there was a family partner check-in, and then there was also youth advocate check-in. So it was very specific, knowing that their needs were different. And then there would be team building activities. But there was also like, how do we know if it's met or not met? Given that there are 6 different measurements, what considers met and what considers not met, and you'll see those down below. And then to the right under updates is how we track that information. Wellness groups were held. So we're saying, hey, we're on track with these things. We're holding wellness groups every 3rd Friday. We have a sobriety focused recovery and recharge meeting held every Monday. We have individual team meetings. We have team building opportunities, and then training topics. And so that leads us to that merit-based pay. That outcomes activity measurement is essentially, what will go into the employee's plan as well. So this one's a leadership team OAM. However, in our employee plans, specifically, their wellness planning would be in their employee development plan. And so we would be following up with them on that. We're also following up with them on how quickly documentation is being turned around. So that's all a part of the action planning. And then knowing whether they've met it or not then directly correlates to their merit-based pay at the end of the year. So this is just sharing there's generally, 2 conditions that require that system to work. That it must be, employee performance must be measured and measurable, and that we need the tools to determine, when that merit-based pay is going to happen. And so that is those systems. Systems is really important for being able to capture it. That communication with our team members as well when we're putting a plan together and making sure that we need to adjust it. And we do mid-year adjustments and make sure that, if the plan is not working, we go back and we adjust to make sure that those needs are being met. I think that goes back to when we're thinking about the planning, that there's also a culture of transparency. So information is flowing in both ways. It's collaborative, it's transparent, it's collected from stakeholders, both internally and externally. So we're defining what we want to measure and the infrastructure that we need to collect it. Our electronic health record allows us to capture important information, as well as we were previously using Peak as our HR system to manage plans. And now we're moving to, Christina, help me out here, UKG. UKG now helps us to track our infrastructure as well as our plans that we're putting into place. That will be the new system we're moving over to.
It's a one-stop shop.
There's so many different approaches to, ensuring that a plan is in place, and also how successful that plan gets implemented. We have 4 areas that we consider helpful in executing the plans: execute, excite, explore, and examine. Every person on our team is so unique in what their area is in regards to kind of their style of getting things implemented and how they communicate that. And so I know I function high in execute. I'm like, what's the job? How do we get it done? Christina is team excite. Like, she loves to get people excited. We have a change happening right now. If you're familiar, if you have lived experience and you're in California, you're familiar that the peer certification process is very much so underway, and something that's impacting us and will impact our agency culture. It's important to have all different facets of excite, execute, explore, and examine, because it helps us to better engage all of the different types of styles when it comes to learning learning, when it comes to communicating. And so it's really important for us to know where someone sits so that we know kind of where to champion those folks and to bring in the right people. Because I also go right to execute, there's times where it's like, where I needed to step back and examine something more or ask more questions. And we've got other folks on the team who will say, well, what about this? Or have we considered this, right? And so all of those pieces are really important to being able to do that action planning, because it allows us to put together a very thoughtful and intentional plan when we're looking at things. We also want to understand the story as well. So making sure that not just leadership understands how to use data and ask the right questions and understand what's going on, but everyone is trained in accessing and understanding the data, that they all understand the benefits of collecting and reviewing data, because we know that numbers do in fact tell a story. Some of it is quantitative data we want to collect, but qualitative data is also just as important, because sometimes there is something that quantitatively we tracked and the outcome is low, but the qualitative data tells us the story behind, or the why behind why it might have, the outcome was achieved in this way, or why we might have scored low in a certain area. And that gives us the feedback to know where we need to change some of our approaches to things, both with youth and families, but also within our organization, for change within the organization as well. So, again, taking action, right? So making sure improvements are based on what we're assessing, what we're evaluating, and the data that's collected. And that as we're making those changes, that the overall actions and those changes are in alignment with our organization's mission, vision, and values. So even considering, say, our last session on diversity, equity, and inclusion, if your organization currently doesn't have that as a value, but you're coming in and saying, this is something that's really important to change, you're going to be met with a lot of resistance, because your organization's overarching mission, vision, and values are not reflective of having, diversity, equity, inclusion embedded. I hope that's not the case for anyone. However, it is a reality for organizations. And so you really do want to make sure that, as you're moving forward with a new plan, if you're looking at addressing crisis, but you're missing some of the key components of valuing youth and family voice, you're going to probably be met with more resistance and challenges in implementing the plan if it's not in alignment with the org's mission, vision, and values. So explore and examine how are they different? So that's a great question, because I had the same one as well when I was learning these. I'm like, oh, both of them sound like a bunch of questions. And essentially, some of it is, there's some overlap between explore and examine. I think of it as like, say we've got a new project, explore is those first, like, what might that look like? Or there's a lot of reflective questions around exploring how it works. Examining is more of the critical eye around, I'm going to examine if this will work for the organization, versus exploring, which is more of the opening to something new. It's not a critical eye, but just really exploring.
We hope to see you all soon. Come back and join us.